So this module, we're going to look at unstructured storage as a component of Azure Storage Services. Now, where does unstructured storage fit in the grand scheme of Azure Storage? Well, it's not typically part of infrastructure. Unstructured storage is what's known as blob storage, which is most commonly leveraged as part of our platform as a service component. Now, it's worth pointing out that Azure disks on the back end, so VHDs on the back end, actually leverage a form of blob storage to store those files. So this is one of the underlying core components of Azure Storage. So with blob storage, blob standing for, by the way, binary large object. So this is simply an unstructured piece of data. It may represent a file, it may represent an image, it may represent data, sensor from IoT. You know, it can literally be anything that you want it to be. There's a couple of different types of blob storage. We'll talk about blocks, pages, and also append blobs. And they've all got different use cases that have different advantages and disadvantages. And again, these are simply part of this underlying distributed storage system. And it could be argued that the blob storage mechanism is the core of the Azure Storage Engine. So what is the blob storage service? Well, it's the object storage platform that's for both storing structured and unstructured data. So all kinds of data, tables, queues, disks, files, at the end of the day are stored on some form of blob storage. So as an example of the types of data you might store in a storage blob, app and web scale data. So how big an application is, metrics that determine if it scales up or scales down. Backups, right? As you do backups of files, folders, virtual machines, services, those can all be stored. Those backups can be stored natively in the Azure Blob Storage Service. And then also massive quantities of data coming from, for example, Internet of Things. As we deploy sensors into everything in the world through Internet of Things, that generates massive quantities of sensor data. And the Azure Blob Storage Service is designed to be the repository for those massive, massive, massive quantities of data. Think about, for example, video archives from a city's worth of traffic cameras. It's got to be stored somewhere. The blob service is optimized for that type of storage. Now within it, there are three types of blobs. We have what are called block blobs. Now, block blobs are, at the end of the day, mainly a file, right? It's a block of data that can be up to a maximum size. And the most common use case for this is storing files in Azure, right? A file is a very simple example of a block, such as images, videos, etc. The second type is what's called an append blob. Now, an append blob is this notion of multiple writers storing data, but are only appending data, they're not changing data. So for example, I want to store video archive footage is a good example of an append blob. I'm not going to change anything, I'm just going to add, and many people, many entities, many applications, many sources can all add to this at the exact same time. And then finally, page blobs. Page blobs are for large storage objects that within themselves are going to have random reads and writes occurring. So some examples of this might be very large database files, or the simplest and most relatable example is VHDs, disks that are used to power virtual machines in Azure are actually stored as page blobs. Because within the virtual machine, you're reading and writing individual files. That's an example of how a page blob operates. And in fact, VHDs are stored as page blobs. So what does the ecosystem look like? Where do we find blob storage? Well, it's prolific throughout Azure. If you look at all these different scenarios, for security, Key Vault uses blob storage. Azure Active Directory uses blob storage. For compute, virtual machines, containers, functions all store their underlying data in Azure Blob Storage. For Internet of Things, we talked about this notion of IoT Hub and Stream Analytics, and also the Event Hub capturing all that data from all these different sensors. So as you can see, this is the core of the Azure Storage Service, and it's prolific throughout every single component of Azure. A big component of what blob storage is used for is big data. You know, as we capture massive, massive quantities of data, all these different services within Azure designed to perform data analytics, data aggregation, and then turning that data into something that's visually appealing that we can look at and understand and make decisions on, all rely on blob storage on the back end in some shape, form, or another, whether it's VHDs, whether it's tables, or whether it's just natively reading and writing from a page blob or a block blob to handle all that data. So again, just kind of pointing out how prolific this is, and within the framework of all the things that Azure does, everything at the end of the day, if you trace it back, you wind up in some form of blob storage. So we're going to look at in some of the demos how we create an Azure storage blob and then how we work with some different elements of it. But for now, that's kind of a quick and simple look at it. If you look at some of the ideas to why this, we talk about why it's ideal. Number one, there's limitless scale within blob storage. You're not limited by the size of a VHD. It is literally limitless. It's as much storage as Azure can handle, and it's fully accessible all throughout the globe. It's also some of the cheapest storage that's available. So here's some of the examples of where it's most commonly used. Live data such as video feeds, big data, sensor data, or backups or archives that we want to go back and look at. On the notion of archives, within blob storage, there is the notion of tiers, hot tier, cold tier. There's also being introduced now an archive tier, which as you choose the tier determines the performance that you have, so how quickly you can get access to the data, but it also determines the cost. The archive tier, which is the slowest, is the cheapest. The hot tier, which is the fastest, is the most expensive form. So that's our look at unstructured storage. We'll be taking a look at how we actually going to create these storage accounts as we go through some of the demos.